The client had invested $40 million in the business and was out $40 million. We were not able to finish our diligence until November. They just didn't have the documents. Normal diligence process should be completed in 2 weeks. And the first thing you do if you're buying a company is, does the seller own the shares? The day of signing, I get a phone call, we have a problem. So what's the problem? He says, well, we have $20 million of outstanding letters of credit, so we need to make sure that you're going to indemnify us for those liabilities.
Hi everyone, this is Alexandra Szuszkiewicz and you are listening to Investor Report podcast. Today's guest is
Pollock.
Nice to have you, Paul, in our podcast.
Nice to be here as well.
And today we'll be talking about the legal aspects of the M&A deal. Okay, Paul, could you briefly introduce yourself and the company that you work with?
Sure. I'm Paul Pollock. I'm a corporate finance and mergers and acquisition partner at Crowell & Mooring in New York. Crowell & Mooring is about a 650-person law firm with 9 offices in the United States and London, Brussels, Shanghai, Singapore. We're 42 years old, and U.S. law firms are ranked by something called the American Lawyer every year based upon revenue and profitability, and we're in the top 100 in AM law, and last year we had revenue, so about $590 million.
So do you work mostly on the sell or buy side?
It really depends upon the economic climate at any time. This particular year, I've done a lot of representations that are on the sell side, but it's also beginning to change. In the last 3 weeks, I've gotten 3 buy-side engagements.
So from the legal point of view, which deals are easier?
That's an interesting question. Which deals are easier to do? It really depends. I mean, there's a lot of different elements in the deal process that affect whether a deal is easy or not. First,
Sure.
It's how prepared is the seller, because that's an important aspect of it.
And we'll touch on that.
Okay. The second piece of it is who else is involved in the transaction. So in every transaction, you have an investment banker. You may actually have 2 investment bankers, one representing the seller, one representing the buyer. You also have sets of lawyers, and then you have sets of bankers, and then you have the deal team itself. So some lawyers are more difficult than other lawyers. Some investment bankers are better at getting deals done than other investment bankers. And some sellers and buyers management teams can be more difficult than others. And a lot of it also depends upon the organization, because different organizations have different requirements in terms of when they're doing a deal. So one buyer may be a little less strict on the deal process, while another buyer, particularly corporate buyers, they have to answer to shareholders and other people. So, they may be much more formulaic in the deal process and in terms of the level of review.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so in the future, we're thinking about acquiring a business. From the legal point of view, what should we do? What should we prepare for, or what should we prepare in our company to be ready to acquire a business? And then we'll look at it from the other side, from the seller's perspective.
It's probably not that much.
Okay.
on the buyer's side.
That's good.
What the buyer needs to do, which is not really a legal issue at the outset, is what is the buyer doing? What's its strategic path? And how does it find companies? So if it's big enough, it can do it on its own. It may have an idea of what the marketplace is or who's out there. You can engage investment bankers to do a search for you. Mm-hmm. But also institutionally, you really need to understand what you're looking for. I mean, if you're going to deploy capital, planning for what you want to buy is almost as important as buying it, because you have to make the right decision. So I would say the buy side process is more management driven as opposed to legal driven.
Okay, so the sell side.
The sell side is much more complicated. So there's a bunch of different types of sellers. There are corporate sellers who probably are more organized than others. There's private equity owned businesses, which probably have been acquired at other points in the last 5 years. And so they are probably more organized than even a corporate buyer. And then there's, the normal smaller family owned business, family office, that type of business. For anybody who's doing an acquisition transaction, the planning should begin at least a year and a half in advance.
If you are a seller, if you sell your business.
If you're a seller.
Okay.
And, there's the elements of that I think are important are, first, there's tax planning. Is your company organized the correct way? And will tax issues have a material impact on the business? And are there ways that I can plan in advance for that?
How to plan in advance for that?
Well, then you need a good tax advisor who needs to look at the business, how you've structured it over time, who the shareholders are. There may be estate planning issues for, say you've owned a business for 50 years and you've built it into a $500 million business and you're going to get $1 billion for it. When you sell, all of a sudden, you're going to sit on huge amounts of wealth, even after tax. So you may want to put shares in trust for family members, for others, for charity. There are numerous tax strategies that you might employ to maximize the value and minimize the tax consequences of an acquisition.
And for that, I send you to the episode with Nate Bradshaw. We talk a lot about the tax strategies if you end up with a lot of wealth.
That part of the process needs to be done a year in advance. Less time is finding the right investment banker to sell your business. So there's a lot of bankers out there. They have a lot of different levels of expertise. You have to choose the banker that you think will be able to run the best process for you and maximize value. And different bankers have different expertise in different areas. So
do you recommend that way instead of doing it by your own? Because people can save a lot of money by not hiring the expert, but on the other hand, the expert can bring you a lot of money when you sell the business. So that's kind of like,
I will guarantee you that it is worth every single dollar that you pay an investment banker. Reason number one, they know who all the buyers out there. You may not know who it is. Reason number two, they know all the valuations that are out there. So they're going to make sure that you're on a level playing field with somebody who may, in fact, be more sophisticated. So the investment bankers perform a very valuable contribution to the process, and even more than that, they're gonna earn their fate. If you get a bad investment banker who's ineffective, you're going to wind up with a much more difficult process. So what an investment banker will do is, first of all, they're going to learn about the company. They're going to write a memorandum that's going to be fantastic and glowing pictures and graphs.
Beautiful.
They're also going to position the company for a higher price. So, for instance, just say, let's take the family-owned business where the family is pulling a lot of money out of the business. And so the EBITDA is $50 million instead of $55 million. Well, if somebody looks at a business and says, well, your EBITDA is $50 million, you say that 10 times EBITDA, then it's $500 million. But if you say, listen, it's really 55 because we take $5 million out and you won't have those expenses anymore. Now all of a sudden you can sell EBITDA at $55 million, and then it's a $550 million purchase price instead of a $50. So the investment banker's job is to position the company in the best way possible in order to maximize the purchase price that you're going to get.
Are legal advisors doing that too? Like if the business doesn't hire the legal advisor, what are the risks for them?
Well, they can't. I mean, you can't sell a business without a legal advisor because
they need to be involved.
There's a variety of reasons why they don't. We can talk about that more. But the banker also is charged with beginning to organize the process. So we're going to talk about due diligence. Everybody who's a professional in this area knows what is generally going to be requested in terms of diligence. the documentation, and it's all tied to the purchase agreement and the reps and warranties that are going to be asked. So what an investment banker will do, usually in about 3 months before putting the company on the market, is they will work with the company itself to begin to load documents on a data room so that you're prepared for diligence to start. So the seller's due diligence starts well in advance of the process, because they're going to begin to work with the bankers to make sure that everything that is likely going to be wanted to be reviewed by the buyer is present, so that the process can be done quickly and efficiently. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you the example that we talked about the other day. I was engaged to do a transaction. The buyer and the seller were both sophisticated, but in this case, the business unit that was being sold wasn't a big business unit, and the seller really never paid much attention to it. They hired a banker, they hired a law firm, but they never really gave a lot of thought to the diligence process. And so when we signed an indication of interest, which gave us exclusivity for a period of time in May, we were not able to finish our diligence until November. The reason for that was because they just didn't have the documents available. We'd ask for it, and then we do diligence, and we come back with more questions, and they load more documents. And what that turns into is a really cumbersome, and for the buyer, a very expensive process. Because if a normal diligence process should be completed in 2 weeks with a properly completed data room. Mm-hmm. And if you have to do it for 6 months, just, start adding up lawyer hours and multiplying it by the hourly rate, and all of a sudden you have a very large legal bill.
Is there anything you can do when you are acquiring a business? Like if they are not prepared to be sold?
It depends. I mean, most buyers really, really want the company, and they'll deal with
everything.
They will. So I that's one thing. The other thing that is typically done in this day and age is the seller will engage an accountant to do what's called a quality variance or QE.
Could you explain that for
sure.
people that don't?
It is a process of having an accountant come in and verify the financial statements. So in other words, if you say you have $50 million of EBITDA, you have somebody coming in and is actually verifying those numbers. So they are doing a financial due diligence to make sure that those numbers are true. Mm-hmm. And they will actually deliver that report to the buyer. It used to be the buyer would do it. Okay. Now it doesn't. Sometimes both do it because nobody believes the report. But most of these reports are done by well-known, reputable accountants. And if they weren't true, they would have significant liability as a result of that.
Okay, so the outside people will verify that. Yeah. Okay, and then share the documents with both parties.
Right. So, I mean, once you have that, but the other part of the sell-side diligence is understanding in advance where the skeletons are. Where are the problems? What's going to come out in the diligence process that's going to cause an issue for you? I'll give you a great example, because this is actually one that is a recurring one. Company, and is also we're doing due diligence on a company, and the first thing you do if you're buying a company is, does the seller own the shares? Mm-hmm. So smaller companies in particular, or a lot of companies, just don't have good record keeping. And so when we go in, we're going to ask for all the corporate records, and we're going to say, okay, were these shares authorized? Who bought them? Did they pay for it? If the person transferred the shares, was their document? Were there options issued? Were there option grants issued? Was everything documented properly? That almost never happens. And again, part of it is, who was the lawyer involved? Were the parties sophisticated when they in? And did the parties affirmatively do that? I have another client in this case, in business for 4 years, really successful. They opted not to do proper corporate housekeeping. So now they have a deal, and we're paping over 4 years worth of documentation. It needed to be done, but I will tell you, since we're the seller in this case, the buyer's counsel went crazy because they were doing the due diligence, and they would have inconsistent documentation all out, and that was when we realized, no, we got to redo everything. And so now we've redone it, and the other side says, okay, now tell us which documents we can ignore because they don't apply anymore. So, I mean, it slowed the process down. It was a 2-month process to get the paperwork in order. And it's very important because if you're buying a company, you need to get 100% ownership. You can't get to a closing and, wait a second, John Doe got 5 shares at the inception. We haven't seen John Doe left the business, 30 years ago, and he's gone, but he still owns those shares. You may not even be able to find him.
What would you do in that case?
Well, you do a merger transaction.
Okay.
A merger transaction sort of forces somebody to go along.
Okay.
So that there are ways around it, but I mean that just makes the whole process more cumbersome.
But those are the documents that you need to check and find out about them before you even start the process, right?
So in a perfect world, the seller would have had its lawyers go through all of its stuff and work with the bankers to make sure everything was in proper order. But it doesn't work that way all the time. Mm-hmm. So the great example is we have this concept in the United States of good standing. So in other words, a corporation is formed, let's just say Delaware, and it has to pay annual franchise taxes. And that applies in every state in the country. And every M&A transaction, a corporation represents itself as duly organized, validly existing, in good standing. The reason why it's in good standing is if you're not in good standing, technically you don't have the ability to contract. Mm-hmm. So
what do you mean good standing?
In other words, that you've kept your corporate records with the state current.
Okay.
And so what happens is, Delaware's a good example, but I'll give the Delaware's an easy state to fix things in. So every year you have to pay an annual franchise tax. It may be $30, it may be $300,000, depending upon the size of the company and the assets of the company. If you don't pay your franchise taxes, you'll get notices, but eventually the state of Delaware will dissolve you. Mm-hmm. You're not in good standing anymore. And in order to get back in good standing, you need to pay those taxes. In Delaware, it's easy. You can go that's why people form their business in Delaware. You could go get what you're owed, file the forms, and you're done in 2 days. Other states are not so easy. So we had a deal last year where the company wasn't in good standing. It was a Texas company. And Texas doesn't move very quickly. So they're at the closing. They're looking for a good standing certificate. Sorry, we can't give a good standing certificate because you didn't pay your taxes for the last 3 years. One of my partners, it wasn't my deal, had to actually go and beg the woman in the Texas Secretary of State's office with I'm going to get fired by the client and lose my job if we don't close that day.
Gosh.
And somehow or another, she took pity, so they got it done in a day, which otherwise would have taken 5 or 6 days. New York's another state where you can't beg anybody. So if you haven't paid your taxes, New York, you have to get tax clearance. So once you know what you have to pay, then you have to file it with the state tax. Then tax has to clear you. So now you've had a delay in your transaction. So, I mean, all of this is advanced planning for it. You don't want surprises. One of the deals that we talked about, it was actually the deal that had the bad due diligence. We got to the day of signing, and probably 24 hours before I get a phone call, we have a problem. I said, what's the problem? It says, well, we have $20 million of outstanding letters of credit that we can't get taken out by the closing because they're foreign letters of credit and stuff. We're not going to be able to do it. So we need to make sure that you're going to indemnify us for those liabilities. Now, that was a 4-week delay because now we had to negotiate indemnification for a deal. And, what happens if the letter of credit we're drawn on? How is it going to be? And will you replace it as soon as you can? So there was another a separate indemnification agreement with 6 pages of reps and warranties and agreements. It slowed the transaction down for a couple of weeks.
How come it didn't come out beforehand? Like any time during the due diligence process?
They didn't know about it.
Okay.
It was just, it got lost in the process. And it never should have happened because in the due diligence list and even in the acquisition agreement, there's a representation and warranty that says the company has no indebtedness. Mm-hmm. And indebtedness is a very, very long definition, but it includes guarantees, letters of credit, anything else. Light bulbs should have gone off.
Yeah, right.
But again, they weren't. The owner was not paying attention to what was going on at the company, and the relationship between the company and the lawyers and management was not particularly cohesive.
So if you had to state like few documents that you, or a few things that you need to pay attention to because they are commonly omitted during the due diligence process and they may come up during the closing date and stop the transaction overall, what would it be? What should we look out for?
Honestly, it truly could be anything. Another scenario, which I think I talked about the other day, was a client didn't know that it had most favored nations clauses in its contract.
What does it mean?
In other words, a clause that says if we give a better price to anybody else, you'll get the benefit of that same price.
Okay.
So that's a most favored nations clause. The contract said, except as you've disclosed to us, there are no most favored nations clauses. Well, the day before we signed the contract, the client started giving us contracts that they didn't even tell us about it. One of my associates was reading it and he says, they have most favored nations clauses in these contracts. And they really, really wanted to close at the end of a month. And I said, we can't close. Why can't you close? I said, because I can't make the representation and warranty. The buyer was willing to take that language out of the contract. Say, okay, we'll live without that language. We know that there's most favored nations clause in it, but they were familiar enough with the business that they were willing to take the business risk that it wasn't going to have a major impact on the business after the buyer owned it.
Is there anything you could do instead of just like saying that I will accept it?
Well, yeah, you can. If you're the buyer in that instance, and somebody doesn't want to say, you could, as a buyer's counsel, you could say, well, then indemnify us if we're damaged as a result of those contracts. Now, in this case,
Gotcha.
we would have said, no, we're not going to agree to again, since they didn't know about it, we didn't know how many more most favored nations provisions they were in there. So they were exposing themselves to potential unknown liability. What we would have had to do if the buyer had insisted on that language is basically stop the process, go through all the contracts that they had. There were, I think, 240 contracts, and verify that there weren't any provisions in there.
That takes a lot of time. They wouldn't be able to close.
We would not have been able to close on that day.
That fast time. Yeah.
But by the time you get to a contract signing or even a contract closing, you've kind of gotten to the point where diligence will stop at some point. And so you're not going to find anything. The only way you're going to find it is if there's a new contract that would create an exception to the reps and warranties that would have to be disclosed. So in most cases, once you're at the point where diligence has stopped. So for instance, in this particular case, there was a general indemnification for breaches of representations and warranties. If we hadn't have found that contract out, we would have closed the deal. And 2 or 3 months later, as the buyer was going through the contracts or negotiating new contracts, they would have come across these most favored nations contract, would have then figured out what the economic impact of those provisions are. And the next thing that would happen is you might get an indemnification notice. And indemnification is you basically have to make somebody whole for the losses that they had. So the contract provides the remedy, but if you had done the due diligence in advance, then you would have never had the problem. I'll give you again. This is not stopping the process, but this is what happens after the fact. This is in the healthcare area. Now we have U.S. healthcare law and fraud and abuse laws, which are very, very strict. So say you buy a medical practice. There's legal due diligence in medical practice, but there's also other diligence you can do, like billing and coding in our medical system. Billing is the actual, the doctor bills a payor or Medicare or Medicaid for it, but the billing is done by coding. So in other words, if I go to a dermatologist and they remove a something, there's a code that you put in, and coding has reimbursement associated with it. And so a lot of doctors can cheat. And you can find it in the diligence process because you could hire a company, or even law firms can do it. They will take a sampling of the billing and the coding that the doctors have done, and they'll review it. And if there are irregularities, it will show up and you can do it. But instance where a client said, we're okay. And they wound up with, 2 DOJ investigations for this business. And, ultimately that business went under. The client had invested $40 million in the business and was out $40 million.
Ouch.
Now, of course, the client was a billionaire, so they could probably take the loss.
Yeah, but still.
but nobody truly wants to have it. I mean, we have an active litigation department here that is always engaged in some sort of dispute over a contract. And some of it is shocking. I mean, it's, major corporate players who buy businesses and the sellers have misrepresented what the business or hasn't told them something. And then you wind up with litigation. Now, one of the things that sort of mitigates against all of it, but sort of emphasizes, the diligence aspect of this is our system has, to a large degree, replaced traditional contractual indemnification with a rep and warranty insurance policy. And a rep and warranty insurance policy is exactly what it sounds like. You're ensuring that everything that the seller said was true. But it's only going to insure the reps and warranties that you have in the contract. So it doesn't obviate the need to understand the business and to be able to ask for the right things in it and to do the right diligence. Because an underwriter is only going to underwrite based upon the buyer's due diligence of the seller.
What if the seller will tell you something about the business, but it's not on the record? Would that be included in the...
Well, it would, because a rep will say something like, we own all of our intellectual property. It turns out that they don't own all their intellectual property. Now, you'll do your due diligence. The diligence is, how do you make sure you own all the intellectual property? So the basic way is, let's just say it's computer technology. So we have a software program. Okay, who wrote the software? You're going to tell me who the software was written by, who did the coding on it? Did you use any independent contractors or otherwise? One of the recurring problems that some software companies have is you have a guy who, before the company is incorporated, helps you write software. But then the guy disappears into the ether. And, when you start the company, you didn't get that person to assign their intellectual property. So in theory, that person who's not an employee of the company can make a claim that says, I own the intellectual property. The contract itself will say, we own the intellectual property. No conditions to it. The law firm will have done a review of the IP. And so if it turns out to be true that rep and warranty is untrue, because you did the diligence, the insurer is going to underwrite it.
I hope I get it, because that was a complicated one. But so just to recap, so you have the document, reps and warranties, but if this person that ran away somewhere owns the code or whatever he created, and we buy this company, because of this warranties, we now can own it, right?
No,
because that's
no, you're going to have to. So take the.
Sorry, technical language.
So take the example of the guy that's out there.
Yeah.
Who 2 months after the closing comes back and says, I wrote this software.
Okay.
So the damage is going to be, how much do you have to pay this guy to get full ownership of the software? So
probably a lot.
so let's say, it's a $100 million deal, and you say to the guy, okay, we'll pay you $5 million to assign your rights to us. Buyer has now been damaged to the amount of $5 million. So they will, if there's no indemnification provision, they will go to the insurer and make a claim against the policy.
What if the guy doesn't show up, but that there is someone out there that owns this?
Well, you wouldn't know.
Okay.
Because that's the thing. If you knew there was somebody out there,
gotcha.
Then you'd have to disclose that.
Gotcha. Okay, gotcha. That makes sense. Let's say we are prepared. Seller company is prepared. Acquirer company is prepared. We are at the closing date. We closed. There's a day one. What is the day one at the first place? When is it? What legal team needs to do during the day one? Just like explain it all.
So the answer to the question is not much.
Okay.
By the time you've gotten to the closing, all of the legal stuff has been taken care of. So let's talk about some of the things that happen between the time you sign and the time you close. If you're a foreign buyer and there's national security issues involved, you may have to comply with what's called CFIUS, which is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It reviews any transactions which it believes has national security's implication to it. That means anything technology related, anything that could be exported to China or Russia or a sanctioned country or anything along those lines. So that may be one thing that lawyers will do in between the time from signing and closing. You may have antitrust approval. So there's something called Hart-Scott-Rodino Antitrust Improvements Act, which requires transactions over a certain size with buyers and sellers over a certain size to file with the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission a pre-merger notification form. And
Pre-merger.
So in other words, before you can close, you have to get approval for that transaction. In most cases, it's easy, but you could have a big transaction, shopping stores, Albertsons. They signed a contract last year, over a year ago. The deal hasn't been approved yet because they've spent the last year negotiating with the Federal Trade Commission on divesting stores so that the buyer would not have too much concentration in certain areas.
Yeah.
So you have antitrust approvals. You may have a litany of contracts that require consents. So in other words, there's going to be a rep that talks about no conflicts with contracts, but there's always going to be numerous contracts which say, even in a stock deal, a transfer of shares or a change of control of a company is going to require the written consent of the counterparty. Typically happens in real estate stuff or big contracts. So somebody's going to have to go approach those third parties and get those third parties to do. If the seller has liens on the company, somebody's going to the lawyers have to negotiate with the bank of payoffs so that the assets get transferred. Assets of the company are free and clear of any encumbrances. You may have real estate transfer issues. So there's a number of you may want to sign employees to long-term contracts because you want to keep management happy. You may give them a bonus if they stick around for a certain period of time. All of that stuff gets negotiated in between the time you sign a contract and when you close the transaction. So there's a lot of activity in that post-signing, pre-closing period. But when the deal is done, that's when the non-lawyers take over and do it. The things that lawyers will do afterwards is most transactions have an adjustment process. So in other words, usually it's just working capital and things like that, or make sure that all the expenses have been accounted for properly. So 90 days later, there's a true up. The lawyers get involved in that. But after that, you kind of cross your fingers and hope, well, maybe they don't need us after that.
Okay, so day one is actually mostly for the operators. And
day one is mostly for the operators.
Okay.
I mean, again, I go back to pre. Let's just say you don't like a contractor, you want to extend a contract with a key supplier. You might negotiate that during the interim period as well.
It sounds that seller has a lot of work to do before due diligence. Then due diligence, that's when you come on both sides, seller and acquirer.
It starts out with seller's lawyers in advance of whether you know that who the buyer is.
Okay.
The buyer's lawyers don't get involved until there is usually some sort of written document that said, we want to do a deal with you. Once that document is in place, then buyer will start its due diligence. Us lawyers have what we call due diligence lists, which are really just tied to reps and warranties. So it's like if I say, I know there's a rep that says we own intellectual property, we're going to ask for information about, who developed it? Did you have what we call work for hire agreements with independent parties so that you own it? So those are all the things that anybody would know in advance are going to be basic request documents. So if you have that all set up in advance of when you sign that, then the buyer is going to be in a position to do its due diligence in a week's time and say, yay or nay, we're going to do this deal. And then you can proceed to negotiate a contract in a reasonably expeditious manner. Otherwise, you wind up with a situation where you start a diligence process in May, you finally sign the contract in November because diligence wasn't there, things were not disclosed, things were discovered at the last second, and then, the post-closing takes a while and it takes you almost a year to get a deal done. Most deals that don't have major, CFIUS is one thing I'll talk about. CFIUS is not a organized process.
What is CFIUS?
It's this committee of governmental agencies, but it's not one governmental agency. You have people from the Department of Defense, you have people from the State Department, you have people from the Air Force, you have people from the Army. You have like 9 or 10 groups who are looking at the transaction, and they all act independently. So you can get from CFIUS a set of questions from the Defense Department, and 2 days later you can answer those questions. And 2 days later, you will get the exact same questions from the Army.
At least you answered those, so.
but that process can go on numerous times. I will tell you a transaction I did earlier this year where we didn't think CFIUS applied, but we decided to go through the process anyway. The way CFIUS works is if you go through the process, it gets cleared, or it doesn't get cleared. You have to make some modifications. Mm-hmm. Most cases, if you're dealing with friendly countries, like if you're dealing with Spain in the United States or Europe with the United States, it's not going to be a problem. There's no such thing as a deal with Russia in the United States now. It wouldn't ever get clearance. It's pretty much the same with China if it involves technology. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, they're going to go through the process. And the CFIUS process on a deal where we didn't think it applied, it took them from the middle of March to the middle of May to clear it. This was what they cleared. Wow. CFIUS doesn't apply. So it took them 2 months to come to the conclusion that the deal didn't apply. But if you don't file and you take a chance, CFIUS can always go back and look at the transaction.
How do you know if the transaction applies or not?
Okay, like we have experts in CFIUS who are looking at the business and whether it falls within the regulations that govern CFIUS. As a matter of fact, right now I have a transaction that's a relatively small transaction, but our CFIUS people are doing the analysis to see if we need CFIUS approval for the transaction.
Mm-hmm. But it's mostly it's mostly about the deals that are cross-border deals, right? It's
all cross-border.
Only.
This is an exclusive U.S. deal that has no CFIUS element to it.
Okay.
But the U.S. deals might have antitrust issues.
Yeah. Okay.
So what we were talking about was how long should a deal take from beginning to end? And the answer should be 3 months. So
that would be like a regular process.
That would be a normal process where you didn't have to have CFIUS approval, because you go from what we call the IOI or the LOI stage, which is when the buyer will actually ramp up its process. Then there'll be a 2 to 3 week period of due diligence. You may begin to negotiate a contract during that period of time. So figure 6 weeks to get the deal signed, and another 6 weeks to get the deal finished would be a normal time frame for a transaction.
What was the longest one that you had?
A year was the longest one, and that's not good.
I had someone that told me it was 2 years for them one time, but it was because of COVID. So,
COVID could have had an impact.
What was the shortest deal?
5 days.
5 days.
Yeah, those are usually like distressed acquisitions.
What does it mean, distressed acquisition?
So in other words, the company is insolvent and they have a lender who wants to. It's 5 days is probably, but you have I guess you could do it in 5 days. A lender the company is not going to be able to pay the loan back, so the lender will foreclose and they'll sell the assets to a buyer, so that the buyer can take over the company and recapitalize it.
Okay. And you were involved in situations like that?
Yeah.
And how does it look like from the legal point of view? Like, are there a lot of papers, or since it's such a fast process?
Much less papers.
Okay.
So if you're doing a situation like that, if a bank is foreclosing, you're going to be buying assets. So for the most part, you're leaving the liabilities behind. You're going to pick and choose the assets that you want to buy. You're putting into new entities, so you're protected from a lot of the older liabilities. So you still have to do your due diligence because you have to know what the business is.
Yeah.
And you don't know necessarily, if a contract could still have a provision that has a change of control clause. And if it's an important contract, you're going to pay money for a business that you can't operate. So there's diligence in every deal. When you're doing an acquisition like that, it's a much more streamlined diligence process where you're really focusing in on the main contracts, the crown jewels that you want to acquire.
Okay, that sounds easy. Easier than the other process.
Yeah, the other process is a much more deliberate process.
Okay. Is there anything else, since we are at the time, is there anything else that you would like to tell the future acquirers and the future sellers to be prepared for? To have the shortest and the quickest deal and the best deal ever that they've ever done.
So
if you can.
I can. So here's the thing. Make sure you have the right banker. And they're not that hard to find because there are experts on food, there are experts on energy, there's experts on healthcare, there's experts in biotech, pharma, you name it, that there are experts in that area. So it's really important. Number two, from a lawyer's perspective, is make sure you have the right advisor. Because, you can have a business that's worth a lot of money, but it's never gone through a process like this. There is a level of sophistication that these transactions involve. So you might as well surround yourself with the best you can. I mean, your local lawyer who's handled all of your business problems for the last 40 years is not necessarily the right person to do an M&A transaction.
He could be involved, but maybe not do it.
He could be involved, but not doing it. So I've always said that there's the two worst adversaries in an M&A transaction on the other side of a deal are the unsophisticated counsel that doesn't know what they're doing, because I don't want to denigrate myself or my profession, but we're working with basically the same forms all the time. The dance is the same. The reps and warranties are the same. The purchase price, the indemnification, the nuances in some of the business terms of the deal and understanding the deal. But I mean, there's a normal ebb and flow that practitioners in this area have. And if you do a deal once every 5 years, you're not going to know the custom. And I will tell you that there has been an enormous change in how M&A contracts are written over the last 10 years that were never there before. And unless you know what to put in those agreements, you're not going to represent your client properly. The other bad adversary is for deals that aren't big enough to really get anybody's attention, but you're using like one of these fancy New York law firms like ours, having a third or fourth year associate, a young lawyer run the deal is bad as well.
Really?
Well, because they don't have the experience and the knowledge to be able to say to a client, I don't think you have to worry about this, because it's just not a business risk for you, as opposed to somebody who's worried about giving in on anything because they don't want to be challenged. So if you've done this long enough, you're going to know when to put your foot on the gas and when to take your foot off it.
As a lawyer, do you have to have an experience in a given industry, or would you recommend a lawyer that has experience in industry?
Great question. And it also actually goes back to due diligence and the contracts. There are people like me who are the deal guys. So we do deals regardless of industry. I've done deals in, I can't even count how many industries, but lots. What you do need is you need a group of what we call specialists who understand some of the more obscure parts of a transaction. So we talked about tax at the beginning. You need a tax lawyer to understand the tax aspects of the business and the transaction. You have employees involved, so you need labor lawyers, employment lawyers who can review the company's documents and plans and make sure that there are no problems. You have, employee benefits, health plans, pension plans, the like. You need people who understand those laws, who can review the company's documents and vet them. So you do need a series of specialists to assist in the transaction. So if you're doing a healthcare transaction, so we have healthcare regulatory specialists who review the regulatory aspects of it, and they'll help out on those pieces of transactions. So a firm like ours with 675 lawyers or thereabouts, we have experts in a variety of different areas. So not everybody has CFIUS experts. We have a bunch of CFIUS experts. We have a large antitrust practice. Other people hire our antitrust group for their transactions. So you do need a staple of specialists to aid in any transaction.
It's not necessary for the lawyers to be specifically in that industry only.
No, but the lawyers who run the deal, the me's, I have to understand something about healthcare if I'm doing a healthcare deal. I have to understand something about tax if I'm doing it. I have to have a basic understanding of employment law. So I guess you could call me a switchblade knife, where you have a lot of different things, but you may not, be able to like skin the beast.
Yeah. That makes sense. That's a good skill set to have.
Yeah.
To be something like that. All right. I think that's all. I know that we didn't cover everything. We could talk for hours. But thank you so much for this opportunity to share your knowledge.
Thanks.
Yeah. And thank you for listening. I hope you liked the video, and see you next time. Bye.